Okay, today we're going to try to discover which nations are going to write the last chapters of the history of mankind. In other words, we're going to find out who is going to fight the last great war. The Bible doesn't really name all of them, but it does name some pretty important ones. We introduced the main player last week, and that was Israel. Today we're going to look at some of the other participants in World War III. Since the restoration of the nation of Israel in 1948, we're probably living in the most significant period of time in human history. We are living in the times that Ezekiel wrote about in chapters 36 and 39 of his prophecy. In chapters 36 and 37, Ezekiel described the rebirth of Israel as a nation. Then he goes right into the discussion of the latter years in chapters 38 and 39. So there is a definite connection between these two groups of events. So let's begin by going to Ezekiel chapter 38. In verse 2, Ezekiel describes one of the main players in the drama as Gog of the land of Magog. He is also called the chief prince of Mesheck and Tubal. Well, right about now, you're probably thinking, great, so what? Well, hold your finger on Ezekiel for a moment, and let's move over to Genesis chapter 10 and read verse 2. So the sons of Japheth, Gomer, Magog, Madai, Javan, Tubal, Mesheck, and Tyrus. Well, do some of those names sound familiar? As near as anybody can figure, Gog is the symbolic name of the leader of the land that was settled by Magog. And as ruler of Magog, he also controls the lands that were settled by Rosh, Mesheck, and Tubal. Magog, Mesheck, and Tubal are all grandsons of Noah. Their father was Noah's son Japheth. Now, there is one other name that I mentioned here that does not appear in the English Standard Bible, and that is Rosh. I'll explain why it doesn't appear in a little bit. But if you take a peek at Genesis 46, verse 21, you'll see that Rosh is a son of Benjamin. He is one of Jacob's grandsons. Okay, so what do all these rusty old relics have to do with the end-time prophecy? Well, I thought you'd never ask. Back in the days following the flood, there were no nations, at least not nations as we understand them today. Instead, people were distinguished by their ancestry and not by the piece of real estate that they happened to occupy. Today, we're called Americans because we happen to live in America, but back then, you'd be known by who you were related to. If we did things the same way today, Central Florida would probably have been divided into the land of Pardon and the land of Overstreet, instead of being divided into counties. Today, we know Israel as a political nation, but back then Israel referred to the descendants of a man named Jacob, who God changed his name to Israel. Well, the same thing is true of Magog. His descendants would have been known as the nation of Magog. Now, the ancient Greeks were familiar with Magog. In their writings, the Greeks would sometimes call them the nation of Magog. But his descendants also belonged to a larger group of people that were known as the Scythians. This group also included the brothers of Mesheck and Tubal. The Scythians were a barbaric group of people who were settled in an area north of the Caucasus Mountains. Any good book that deals with ancient history will tell you that the Scythians are the ancestors of the principal part of the people who populate what was once called the Soviet Union. In fact, the Great Wall of China was once known as the Wall of Magog because it was supposed to keep Magog's descendants out of China. Now, before we go any farther, let's address the question of the breakup of the Soviet Union. We tend to associate the Soviet Union with the country of Russia, but they are not the same thing. The Soviet Union, which was officially known as the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, was actually made up of a number of separate states that had joined together in a fashion very similar to the way the states have joined together to form the United States of America. The big difference is joining the United States was voluntary and joining the Soviet Union was not. Russia was the largest of the countries and the most powerful of these states, and it was dominated by that country. The capital of the old Soviet Union was Moscow, which is in Russia, and after the breakup, Moscow now serves only as the capital of Russia. The other states have their own capitals. The individual states are still cooperating with each other, but they're no longer controlled by one central government. The Bible speaks of these parts of the Soviet Union as separate states. So the breakup actually enhances the prophecies rather than detracting from them. The ruler of Magog is also referred to as the chief prince of Mesheck and Tubal. Not only did all translators include the name Rosh in this list, there is some controversy as to whether this word is really a proper name or simply an adjective of the Hebrew word nosi, which is a translation which is translated prince. Okay, let's look at the next name, Mesheck. Wait a minute. I think I skipped some information here. Okay. The Hebrew name Rosh literally means top or head. So some translations show it as the adjective of the word prince, and the English Standard Version that I'm using is one of them. So in those translations, the phrase reads, the chief prince of Mesheck and Tubal. However, some modern translations will show it as the proper name Rosh. And as I said earlier, Genesis 46 verse 21 identifies Rosh as the son of Benjamin. Byzantine and Arabic writers will often refer to Rosh as, in their own dialects as Ros or Rush, and they refer to them in connection with the Scythians. These people settled north of the Taurus Mountains and along the Volga River. We get our word Russia from the name Rush. Okay, let's look at the next name as Mesheck. According to the great Hebrew scholar Wilhelm Gesenius, Mesheck was the founder of a tribe of Scythians who lived in the Moschian Mountains. These mountains are a smaller group of peaks. They are connected with the Caucasus Mountains, connected Caucasus Mountains with the Taurus Mountains, and they don't show on many modern-day maps. But besides that, in Greek, Mesheck's name is Moskai, and that name is where the city of Moscow gets its name. In Russian, the city is known as Moskva, and the people who founded it were called the Muscovite. Okay, this leaves us with Tubal. According to Wilhelm Gesenius, Tubal founded a tribe that the Greeks called the Tiberini. This bunch of settled next to the Black Sea and to the west of the Muscovites. This area is known today as Ukraine. Now, just as a footnote here, the main reason that Russia felt confident enough to attack Ukraine can be traced back to the bumbling Bill Clinton. After the breakup of the old Soviet Union, Ukraine was the third largest nuclear power in the world with over 5,000 nuclear warheads. Well, Clinton told the Ukrainian government that if they would return their nuclear arsenal to Russia, the United States promised to defend them if the Russians ever attacked them. And Donald Trump and Putin did not think about attacking the Ukraine, because if they did, they would abide by Trump would abide by that agreement. Well, Vladimir Putin took one look at Joe Biden and saw nothing but weakness. So he felt comfortable in attacking Ukraine because he knew that Biden wouldn't do anything significant to stop him. And China is watching very closely to what's happening in Ukraine because they have their eyes on Taiwan. Now, what sort of message does that send to the world? The U.S. has abandoned everybody that has ever promised to protect. So any agreement made with the United States isn't worth the paper it's printed on. All right, let's look at Ezekiel chapter 38, verse 15. Ezekiel says this about Gog: you will come from your place out of the uttermost parts of the north. A phrase, uttermost parts of the north, translates the Hebrew words, Yurakah Tosophon. It speaks of the north in a kind of a very general term. It's sort of called the northern region. It's kind of like the way we refer to anything as north of Florida. We just say it's up north. The literal translation of Sophon is a dark and hidden place. To the Hebrews, it referred to a place that was too far north to really locate exactly. Of course, our world is much smaller today, so to the Hebrew, this place is about as far north as you could go. And this is significant in the fact that if you draw a line due north from Israel, the last country you go through is Russia. And the last major city that you would go through is Moscow. And a straight line through the center of Jerusalem ends up in the center of Moscow. All right, let's look at some of Magog's other allies. We call them the kings of the south. We meet them in Ezekiel chapter 38, verse 5. The first name that's mentioned is Persia, and that one's pretty easy to identify. Persia is known as Iran today. Well, Iran isn't exactly anybody's friends, least of all Israel's. Iran has already tried to purchase several nuclear warheads from Kazakhstan, and no one can really tell for sure whether they actually got them or not. But even if they didn't, it's thought that with Russian and Chinese help, Iran will be able to produce its own nuclear weapons within the next couple of years. And in order to cover up where the aid is coming from, much of what is being given to the Iranians is funneled through North Korea. Well, the deal that John Kerry had brokered with Iran a few years ago when he was Barack Obama's Secretary of State guarantees that Iran will become a nuclear power in a few years. All it did was destroy the sanctions that had been imposed on Iran. Sanctions that were working to stop Iran's nuclear program and gave them more money to continue developing nuclear weapons. In return, Iran promised to produce a lesser amount of nuclear material for the next 15 years. That agreement accomplished absolutely nothing for the United States, and it was a godsend for Iran. Assuming that Iran lived up to that agreement, and they have never honored any agreement that they've made in the past, all it does is postpone the inevitable. In other words, it gives Iran the time and money it needs to complete their nuclear plans unhindered and return to a promise of to load the gun a little bit slower. This is what it's like telling the Iranians, if you agree not to kill me now, I'll let you kill me later when it's easier. Now, the thought of a nation like Iran being armed with nuclear weapons should be enough to keep us awake at night. And remember what I told you about Iran's government. Their government is populated by 12ers. 12ers are people that are convinced that if they can create enough chaos in the world, they can hasten the return of their Messiah figure, the Mahdi, who is also known as the 12th Imam. And what better way to create chaos than to explode a nuclear weapon? Well, the bulk of Iran's arms have come from Russia, and much of their nuclear capabilities comes from Russia and China, being funneled through North Korea. And that includes several Russian Kilo-class diesel submarines that can carry nuclear missiles. Next is Ethiopia. The word Ethiopia is a transliteration of the Hebrew word Cush. If you look at Genesis 10, verse 6, you'll find out that Cush is another one of Noah's grandsons. His father was Noah's son Ham. Well, the Cushites were black men, and the word Ethiopia is very often used in ancient writings to describe the black peoples of Africa. There are many nations in Africa today that are emerging from the days of European colonization, and they're being ruled for the first time in modern history by black men. Well, there's only a very small percentage in Central and Southern America that are populated by Jews and Christians, so Israel has no particular religious significance to them. Most of these nations have corrupt governments who are enriching themselves at the expense of their people. So the people are very poor, and they rely heavily on foreign aid for their survival. Over the years, the Russians have done a good job of spreading the communist gospel to these countries, and most of them are sympathetic toward the Russian cause. From a religious point of view, the fastest growing religion in these countries is Islam, which serves to unite them with the Muslim countries of North Africa. Next we have Libya. This is a translation of the Hebrew word put. If you'll look at the Genesis 10 verse 6, you'll see that Put is another of Noah's grandsons. His descendants migrated to the area west of Egypt and in North Africa. Today these people make up the countries of Morocco, Libya, and Algeria, but since the first settlement was called Libya, most ancient writings only mention that country. All of these nations belong to what is called Dar al-Islam, which means the house of or the realm of Islam. Over the years they have also been very pro-Russian, and their armies bear Russian weapons. And being in the Muslim camp, they aren't particularly fond of Israel. Okay, if we move down to verse 6 of Ezekiel chapter 38, we meet a next player in this end times drama, Gomer. And guess whose Gomer's grandfather was? Noah. This one settled in the northern rim of the Black Sea, and then they spread south and west from there. One ancient map of the Russian Empire, or Roman Empire, shows them in the area of what we know as Poland, Belarus, Bosnia, Romania, and East Germany. And even though there have been some bickering with the Russians over the years, and most of them have managed to break away from the communist camp, they're still sympathetic to communist causes. Okay, last but not least is Togarmah. Some translations show the name as Beth Togarmah, which simply means the house of Togarmah. Now, believe it or not, he is not one of Noah's grandsons, but he is one of Noah's great-grandsons. His father was Gomer. Togarmah's descendants settled in what is the southern part of modern-day Russia. Today, that area is known as Kazakhstan, and the people are known as Cossacks. The Cossacks have always been known as expert horsemen. In fact, there are still several divisions of Cossack cavalry in the Russian army today. Their role is really more ceremonial than it is military. Now let's do a little bit of speculating here. The Bible mentions horsemen in Ezekiel 38, verse 4 and 15, and it speaks of the final battle. Well, during the Korean War in the 1950s, the Red Chinese proved that horses are still the best way and the fastest way to move men and equipment over mountainous terrain. And this was proven to be true again during the time that the Russians were fighting the Taliban in Afghanistan, which is a very mountainous area. And it isn't a coincidence that there are mountains between Russia and Israel. Okay, by no means is this a complete list. There are others who will join with Magog in the last great war that is going to be fought on this planet. Ezekiel 38 verse 6 says, "Many peoples are with you." So this is far from being a complete list. But it does mention some pretty significant participants. And isn't it amazing that over 2,600 years ago, Ezekiel predicted so accurately the rise of these nations to power and their political affiliations. Even as recently as 1925, Russia had barely moved out of the 18th century. The old Soviet Union reached its position among the world superpowers almost overnight. If you have any doubts about what I've just said, doesn't it surprise you even a little bit that every country that I've mentioned is already armed with Russian weapons? And none of them would shed a tear if Israel were to disappear from the face of the earth today. Also, be aware that since the breakup of the Soviet Union, these newly independent states are in desperate need of money. And they're sitting on top of tons of military equipment that they really don't have a need for. These weapons and their technology that goes along with them are worth more to them in the open market than they are for their defense. And let's not forget that Biden left billions of dollars worth of the most sophisticated military equipment in the world to the Taliban in Afghanistan to use against us. And I have no doubt that some of it is being studied by Russian and Chinese scientists today in order to find out how to defeat them. And remember, many of the scientists in Russia who developed that type of technology from the Russians are out of work after the collapse of the Soviet Union. So many of them are showing up in Iran, Libya, and other terrorist countries. Many of these weapons are being sold either directly or on the black market to countries who are sympathetic with the Muslim cause. Today, Russian weapons, and especially Russian nuclear technology, is easier to obtain than it ever was. All right, we're not going to spend a lot of time on the next two because they're both fairly easy to identify. We've already talked about the kings of the south. These are the Arab countries called Libya and Put, along with the black African nations called Ethiopia and Cush. Well, the leader of this confederation is named in Daniel chapter 11, verse 8 and 9. It's Egypt. Egypt has long been considered to be the political leader of the Arab world. Egypt fell from grace when the Muslims in 1979, when Egypt's President Anwar Sadat signed a peace treaty with Israel in return for Israel pulling out of the Sinai Peninsula. A few months later, radical Islamists within the Egyptian army assassinated him for doing it. This has been at best a very cold peace. Israel and Egypt are still far from being friendly to one another. Well, since 1979, Egypt has significantly increased its military strength. And most of the increased arms were supplied in the form of billions of dollars, $30 billion worth of foreign aid coming from the United States. For example, Egypt is currently building its own version of the American M1A1 Abrams tank. In fact, they're building more tanks today than the United States is. And Egypt maintains a standby army of over 300,000 men. Now, does that give you the impression that they are a nation that's interested in pursuing peace? Also, if you pay attention to what the Egyptians say to each other and ignore what they feed to the news media, you'll see that they aren't interested in abandoning their animosity toward Israel anytime soon. Most experts feel that Egypt's peace treaty with Israel was just an easy way for them to regain control of the Sinai Peninsula and to gain a greater military advantage over Israel. In fact, given Egypt's military strength, they are probably the greatest threat to the safety of Israel today, treaty or no treaty. And they are exporting the military technology that they got from the United States to other African nations. Well, Egypt, along with other Arab nations in North Africa, will be joined by the black African nations in the south, and along with the help of Syria and Iran, they'll attack Israel from the south. Now, not long after that, Magog, leading the Russian Confederacy, will also attack Israel from the north. Now, you're basically dealing with countries that have corrupt governments. So, ultimately, Egypt is going to be double-crossed by Russia and destroyed, but that's going to happen in a later lesson. The next group of players are mentioned in Revelation chapter 16. The sixth angel poured out his bowl on the great river Euphrates, and its water was dried up to prepare the way for the kings of the east. Now, the words that are translated east in this verse are the Greek words Anatoles Helio. The literal translation is the rising of the sun. So what this verse is saying is to prepare the way for the kings of the rising of the sun. This is the way that many ancient manuscripts refer to the Oriental peoples of the world. And it is interesting to note that the Japanese flag depicts the rising sun. And of course, Japan, with its economic power, is definitely a significant force in that part of the world. But with the communist takeover of China in the late 1940s, the real sleeping giant in the East was awakened. China has gone from being a backward, underdeveloped, isolationist country to a world power faster than any other modern nation. And they did it even faster than Russia did. And as far as the economy is concerned, they did it by dumping a lot of the communist policies and embracing a limited form of capitalism. But China has problems. It has a population of 1.41 billion people and not enough agricultural land to feed them. And its population is growing at a rate of 13% a year. This is why the Chinese government wasn't concerned with killing off a few million Chinese with COVID-19. It was that many less people for them to feed. The bottom line is this: China can't survive on its own. They need allies to survive. And we can already see that the bulk of the Asian continent is aligning itself with Asia, or with China. You see, China's major asset is people. More specifically, people who work cheap and buy things. And as a matter of fact, a lot of stuff is being made by slave labor. This is why President Bush had to bow and give China most favored nation status again. If we won't trade with them, other nations will, and we still lose a lot of money to those other nations. Well, one nation who is doing that more and more is Japan. Now, some people might laugh at the idea of Japan joining with China, but look for it to happen. Japan's labor costs are skyrocketing, and the U.S. market isn't as lucrative as it once was, and the Japanese can't possibly consume all the products that they make. So they're looking at the 1.41 billion Chinese consumers right next door, and their mouths are watering. Well, why would China even consider attacking Israel? Simple, they can't feed the people they have. And the population is growing by between 6 and 20 million people every year. The Chinese government has already made it illegal for couples to have more than one child. This means that there are millions of forced abortions and forced sterilizations being performed in China every year. Well, this has created another problem. It's very important for China to produce male children in order to carry on the family name. So millions of female babies are killed in abortions every year. Right now, there's 117 baby boys born to every 100 baby girls. That means that before too long, there are going to be an awful lot of single men in that country without a woman to keep them in line. Even today, in the 30 to 39 age group, single men outnumber single women by 10 to 1. That can be a very disruptive part of society. In recent years, China has even allowed people to leave the country, and almost 100,000 Chinese enter the United States illegally every year. And since Uncle Joe opened the borders, the figure is probably much higher. So China's problems aren't going to go away anytime soon. Eventually, they're going to have to find something for all those male babies to do. And they're going to have to either find the land to grow the food they need to feed them, or come up with the money to buy it. So what better solution could there be than to take these men and make an army that can seize land and wealth from other countries? Okay, before we go on, let's stop for a moment and recap what we've done so far. First, Israel has appeared as a political nation that is under Jewish control for the first time in over 2,600 years. Second, Russia has risen to the position of a world power in an incredible speed. Even after the breakup of the Soviet Union, they are still a significant world power. And that breakup has actually enhanced the possibility of an attack on Israel. Also, the breakup has made Russian military hardware and technology more available to other countries. Third, after centuries of fighting among themselves, the Arab countries are beginning to cooperate with each other in order to promote the cause of Islam and to work together for the destruction of Israel and the United States too. Some prime examples of the cooperation is seen in OPEC and the Council of Arab States. Fourth, many Central and South African nations are emerging from under the wings of European colonization, and they have black leadership for the first time in history. Most of them are already armed with Russian weapons, and none of them are particularly friendly toward Israel. In fact, many of them are adopting Islam and are cooperating with the Arabs in their fight to destroy Israel. Most of the governments in these countries are so corrupt and unstable that they will follow anyone who will offer them money and protection. Fifth, the Eastern Oriental countries are beginning to form a front around Red China. North Korea, Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia are all pawns of the Chinese. Control of Hong Kong was turned back to the Chinese a few years ago, and China is threatening now to take over Taiwan. Japan is beginning to form a new sphere of economic involvement with China, and they're relying less and less on the United States as their trade partner. We should also mention that Red China and the Russians aren't exactly the best of friends. The Chinese feel that the Russians have not been faithful to communism by trying to become more westernized. For the prophecies to be fulfilled, these two giants must remain on separate sides of the fence, and God is going to see to it that that happens. Next, we want to turn our attention to Rome. The Roman Empire was the most powerful political force in the world that the world has ever known. It held total control over the territories that it conquered, and no single ruling power has ever had so much influence on our modern way of life. It can be seen in our movies, it can be seen in our legal system, it can be seen in our architecture. We can even see it in the Roman candles we shoot off on the 4th of July. How about Caesar salad? But Caesar died, and as all mortals do, and Rome died with him. When Rome is mentioned in the prophetic writings, it was to be a kingdom that would be in power in two phases. It's interesting to note that when phase one of Rome's power was winding down, Rome and the Roman Empire were not overthrown by an outside force. The Roman Empire disintegrated from within through moral decay. Unfortunately, we can see the same thing happening in America today. The decay of our morality can be seen everywhere. See, if God allows America to get away with the things that are happening here today, He's going to owe Sodom and Gomorrah an apology. And I don't think that's going to happen anytime soon. Okay, the prophetic writings tell us that the Roman Empire is going to figure prominently in the world events that are going to occur shortly before the return of Christ to this earth. Now, before you rush home and whip out your Rand McNally, let me say this. The Roman Empire will not be returning to power physically or geographically. The last great empire is going to come out of the cultural heritage that was left behind by the old Roman Empire. Let me draw your attention to the 7th chapter of the book of Daniel. In this chapter, Daniel has a dream. Actually, it was more of a nightmare. In his dream, he sees 4 beasts. The first beast is described in verse 4 as a lion with eagle's wings. The second beast is in verse 5, and it was the bear. The third beast is in verse 6, and it was a leopard with 4 wings and 4 heads. The fourth beast is in verse 7, and this is the beast that we're interested in now. Daniel wrote, "After this I saw in the night visions, and behold, a fourth beast, terrifying and dreadful and exceedingly strong. It had great iron teeth, it devoured and broke in pieces, and stamped what was left with its feet. It was different from all the beasts that were before it, and it had 10 horns." This beast is described as being something that no one has ever seen before. It had great iron teeth, and it used them to crush and devour its victims, and it had 10 horns. After seeing this vision, it's no wonder that Daniel was sort of upset. In verse 15, Daniel says, "As for me, Daniel, my spirit within me was anxious, and the vision of my head alarmed me. But have no fear, an angel arrives in the nick of time to explain this vision to Daniel. The angel tells Daniel that each of these beasts represent a separate world kingdom. Apparently the meaning of the first 3 beasts was obvious to Daniel, because in verse 19 he only asked the angel to explain the fourth beast to him. The first kingdom, represented by the lion with eagle's wings, is Babylon. Babylon became a world power in 606 BC when it defeated the Egyptian army at the Battle of Carchemish. King Nebuchadnezzar took over Babylon when his father Nabopolassar died, and he turned it into a dominant power in the world at that time. The second kingdom was which is represented by the bear, is the Medo-Persian Empire. The Babylonians were defeated by the Persian army in 539 BC when they built a dam across the Euphrates River. This event was announced by God himself in Daniel chapter 5. This is when the hand of God appeared in the palace and wrote on the wall, telling Belshazzar of his downfall. Babylon was such a strongly fortified city that they felt that they were invincible. In fact, they didn't even post guards to patrol the walls. But they overlooked one major chink in the armor. The main source of water for Babylon was the Euphrates River, and the Euphrates River flowed under the wall of the city. This was convenient when they needed water, but all the Persians had to do was build a dam across the river and wait for the water to recede, and they could just waltz under the wall on the riverbed. Now, many people over the years have scoffed at the biblical account of this event. They say that Daniel was just embellishing his story, and as proof they would point out that there was no historical evidence that King Belshazzar or Darius the Mede ever existed. But Daniel said that Belshazzar was the last king of Babylon, and that Darius the Mede was a Persian leader that succeeded him. Now, Daniel also says that Belshazzar's father was Nebuchadnezzar, but the historical record says that Nebuchadnezzar's son Nabonidus succeeded Nebuchadnezzar as king of Babylon. Well, not long ago they discovered some documents in the city of Haran that proved that Daniel was right. It seems that Nebuchadnezzar's son Nabonidus did assume the throne when he died, but Nabonidus got involved in the worship of the Babylonian god Nabu. Well, Nabonidus was more interested in worshiping Nabu than he was in being king of Babylon. So he went off to the nearby city of Borsippa and became a priest of Nabu and only acted as king every now and then. And whenever Nabonidus was away doing Nabu things, his son Belshazzar sat on the throne. So Nebuchadnezzar was actually Belshazzar's grandfather. But since there's no word in the Hebrew language for grandfather, they would refer to any male ancestor by the word father. The Hebrew word that's translated father in verse 11 is the word Ab, and it can be translated into English in several different words, and 3 of them are father, ancestor, or forefather. Well, this discovery also explains why in verse 16 Belshazzar offered to make Daniel third ruler of the kingdom. See, he was second. So he couldn't offer Daniel anything higher than third place because Nabonidus was still king. And Belshazzar was second in command as regent. He was only ruling while his father was away. As for Darius the Mede, it was discovered that in addition to being a proper name, Darius was also used as a title. Well, Darius was another name used by a man named Gubaru. And Gubaru, alias Darius the Mede, was appointed governor by the Persian king. Daniel called him a king because of the amount of power he had. Even though we may call him a governor, he was actually the new king of Babylon. Well, Daniel chapter 5 verse 31 says that Darius received the kingdom being about 62 years old. And chapter 9 verse 7 says that he was made king over the realm. This shows us that Darius was not the supreme ruler of the Persian Empire at the time. He is also not to be confused with Darius I and Darius II, who were kings of Persia. You see, this is why it's possible that Darius wasn't a name at all, but a title that was given to anyone who held a high-ranking position in the Medo-Persian hierarchy, sort of like Caesar was to Rome. Okay, the third kingdom is represented by the leopard with 4 wings and 4 heads. This kingdom appeared about 331 BC in the form of the Greek Empire ruled by Alexander the Great. That empire fell apart when Alexander died at the ripe old age of 35. After his death, the Greek Empire was divided into 4 parts. That's the 4 wings and the 4 heads. Each of these parts was ruled over by one of Alexander's generals. These generals were always fighting among themselves, and because of that, the kingdom really wasn't very stable. This brings us to the kingdom number 4. The beast wasn't represented by an animal. Daniel says it was different. It has 10 horns and great iron teeth. The beast was the most ferocious of them all, and the beast represents the Roman Empire. The Roman army defeated the last of the Greek Empire around 68 BC to become the greatest power the world has ever known. Okay, verse 7 says that it has 10 horns. Then notice what happens in verse 8. I considered the horns, and behold, there came up among them another horn, a little one, before which 3 of the first horns were plucked up by the roots. And behold, in this horn were eyes, and like the eyes of a man, and a mouth speaking great things. Then, in verses 20 to 24, and about the 10 horns that were on its head, and the other horn that came up, and before which 3 of them fell, the horn that had eyes and a mouth that spoke great things, and that seemed greater than his companions. As I looked, the horn made war with the saints and prevailed over them, until the Ancient of Days came, and judgment was given for the saints of the Most High, and the time came when the saints possessed the kingdom. Thus he said, as for the 4th beast, there shall be a 4th kingdom on earth, which shall be different from all the kingdoms, and it shall devour the whole earth, and trample it down, and break it into pieces. As for the 10 horns, out of this kingdom 10 kings shall arise, and another shall arise after them. He shall be different from the former ones, and shall put down 3 kings. All right, now that I have succeeded in thoroughly confusing you, bear with me a little bit more, and I'll try to make it clearer. The 4th beast represents the Roman Empire. Out of the Roman Empire, phase 1, will come 10 kingdoms. That's the original 10 horns. Later, another kingdom will appear. That's phase 2. That's the little horn. And this kingdom is going to revolve around one man who will rule the whole earth as a totalitarian dictator. In other words, this kingdom is going to be ruled over by one man who will have total power. In verses 21 to 22, we're told that this ruler will be in power until the Ancient of Days comes. In other words, he'll rule until Christ returns. Verse 21 says that he's going to make war with the saints, and he's going to win, at least temporarily. This king is going to gain power by subduing 3 kings by force. Whether this is really by economic force or military force really isn't clear. But as soon as the other 7 see what happened to the 3 that resisted him, they're going to give up without a fight. This ruler is called by many names in Scripture. He's called the beast, the abomination that causes desolation, the lawless one. But the most common name given to him is the name that the Apostle John gave him. That's the Antichrist. Well, it's appropriate since he's going to be worshipped as Christ, and he'll be the exact opposite of Christ. This is why the horn that represents him has a human face. The kingdom is going to revolve around one man, and he will be an absolute ruler. He will rule over the 10-nation confederacy that will come from the heritage of the old Roman Empire. And he's going to rule until Christ returns. Now comes the hard part. Who are the 10 nations? Well, that's not really clear. But if we do a little speculating based on current events, we can make a good guess. You see, there is an organization which is active today in the area where the roots of the Roman Empire are, and that's in Europe. That organization is very closely to uniting with many European countries into a United States of Europe, so to speak. It started out as the European Common Market. The Common Market was born in 1957 with 6 nations, and it's interesting to note that the agreement that was formed, that organization was drafted and signed in Rome. In January of 1973, England, Ireland, and Denmark joined, bringing the count to 9. In 1981, Greece was accepted, making it 10. Now, let me read to you a quote from the July 1969 issue of Time magazine. So all go according to the most optimistic schedules, the common market could someday expand into a 10-nation economic entity whose industrial might far surpass that of the Soviet Union. Of course, with the breakup of the Soviet Union, that is now a fact. On July 17, 1979, the European Common Market took the next step in elevating itself to the position of from the position of simply being a trade cartel to becoming a bona fide world government. It formed a parliament, and it set up its capital in Brussels, Belgium. In January of 1985, Spain became the 11th member, and there was some great speculation at the time that the president of Spain might turn out to be the Antichrist. And it is interesting to note that the vote to admit Spain was split 7-3. Daniel says that when the new world dictator takes power, these horns will be plucked out by the roots and 7 will follow willingly. Well, maybe that vote was the beginning of a trend, I don't know. With the admission of Portugal a few years later, the membership of the European Common Market jumped to 12. In 1993, as the move to the United States of Europe progressed, they started calling themselves the European Community instead of the European Common Market. Then in January of 1994, they created the European Monetary Institute located in Frankfurt, Germany. The plan was for this organization to become a central bank for the group and to start issuing a common currency no later than 1999. That common currency became the euro. And many countries have abandoned their own currency for the euro. They also created the Western European Union to be the defense arm of the group. Of course, they expected the United States to protect them under the NATO treaty, and each nation was supposed to kick in a percentage of their GNP to cover the cost, but none of them are doing it. Trump was trying to get these countries to pay up, and they were fully capable of doing it, but Biden doesn't care, so the United States is still footing the bill. And that costs you and me billions of dollars every year. The group has also expanded its influence over the last few years to include other theories other than trade, such as education, public health, culture, consumer protection, research and development, and social issues. The European Community is also funding massive building projects such as new roads, rail lines, and communication networks. All of these things are designed to draw these countries closer together and are pointing toward the United States of Europe. Well, is this organization powerful? Even as early as 1980, the European Common Market's combined gross national product was almost equal to that of the United States. It accounts for 21% of the world's industrial production and 35% of all the world's trade. So I still feel that the European Union, or the organization like it, is still the best candidate for the revised Roman Empire. They're moving closer every day to becoming United States of Europe. The Eurocrats in Brussels have even gone so far as to form a Father Christmas World Congress in order to standardize the celebration of Christmas throughout Europe. The original president of Father Christmas World Congress was a professional clown who worked at an amusement park in Copenhagen named Groth Rasmussen. He said children's behavior will probably have to be standardized too. His plan is to make every aspect of life in Europe conform to this one-size-fits-all model of life. So we need to turn the little kiddies into mind-numbed robots in order to make them toe the party line. And we're doing that ourselves by allowing the left to control our education system. Our schools have become indoctrination centers rather than education centers. Currently, the official name for the group is the European Union, and there are currently 28 member nations, but only 10 of those nations are in the area of Europe that would be part of the old Roman Empire. And there are several nations in the process of leaving the group. Great Britain tried, but the people voted, when the people voted to leave in the last election, the Liberals in Parliament blocked the effort. The number of nations involved in the EU has varied up and down over the years, so who knows what the number will be when that time comes. But even if the total number exceeds 10 of the 28 nations currently involved, there's only about 10 of them that have any power and are in the areas that we could call the heritage of the Roman Empire. The rest of them are just sort of along for the ride. Another group to consider is OPEC with 13 member countries. But for that to work, we have to toss out the idea that this group will come from the old Roman Empire. Now, over the years, some people have pointed to NATO as being the 10-nation confederacy. Well, NATO was formed to present a united front against the Soviet Union after World War II. And now that there is no Soviet Union, it has sort of outlived its usefulness. So my money's still on the European Union. Okay, what role would the United States play in all this? Well, there are four possibilities. First, the United States would be defeated in a war and absorbed by another country. Second, the United States will become so morally decayed that it will cease to be an effective influence in world politics. The United States has been inviting judgment on itself for quite some time now. In fact, so has the rest of the world. But the United States was a nation that was founded as one nation under God, and it has truly betrayed that heritage. Jesus said, "Everyone to whom much was given, of him much will be required, and from him to whom they entrusted much, they will demand the more." The Lord has blessed this nation so greatly. No other nation in history has been so prosperous. And because of that blessing, we have great responsibility. If we continue to push God out of our public life, He's going to remove His blessing. We've seen the pattern repeated over and over again in the Bible, so we can't say that we haven't been warned. But in spite of the warnings, we continue to exclude God from our public life. In the last 30 years, there have been a 700% increase in violent crimes. Illegitimate births have increased by 419%. The divorce rate is tripled. The teenage suicide rate has increased to a point where it's now the second leading cause of death among people under the age of 20. And student achievement test scores have dropped by 80 points. We are no longer ruled by any sort of a moral standard. We're being told that to live by the "if it feels good, do it" mentality. And we're going to pay a price for that. We can see this in the old Soviet Union. Without a firm moral base, the only way that you can make people accountable to society is through coercion and terror. And that is exactly how the Soviet government did it. But since the collapse of the totalitarian system, the republics have gone into moral chaos. Crime has skyrocketed, and there's no way to stop it. The third option goes hand in hand with the moral decay, and that would be economic bankruptcy. 30 years ago, the United States was the world's largest creditor nation. Today, it's the world's largest debtor nation, and we can't seem to come up with a plan to pay off the debt. George Washington said this in 1796 as part of his farewell address. As a very important source of strength and security, cherish public credit. One method of preserving it is to use it sparingly as possible, avoiding occasions of expense by cultivating peace. But remember also that timely disbursements to prepare for danger frequently prevent much greater disbursements to repel it, avoiding likewise the accumulation of debt, not only by shunning occasions of expense, but by vigorous exertions in time and peace to discharge the debts which unavoidably wars may have occasioned, not ungenerously throwing upon posterity the burden which we ourselves ought to bear. Well, we should heed that advice. We keep spending like drunken sailors, and we're taxing our people into financial ruin. The national debt now exceeds $31 trillion. That's $920,000 per taxpayer. And politicians talk about trillions of dollars as though it was pocket change. But let me give you an idea of how much $31 trillion is. If you stack $31 trillion $1 bills, that stack would reach the sun and back 15 times. That stack of bills would be almost 3 billion miles high. If a jet flying at the speed of sound was reeling out a roll of dollar bills behind it, it would take 434 years to reel out $31 trillion. If you were to spend $40 per second every year, or every day, it would take you 24,554 years to spend $31 trillion. The fact is, no nation has ever taxed itself into prosperity. And no nation has ever survived economically by taxing its citizens at a rate of over 50% of their incomes. The fourth option is probably the most desirable, and that would be that we would just be an equal part of the European Union. Up until just recently, the European Union relied on the United States for protection, but the Europeans are afraid that they can't rely on us anymore. I mean, why should they? I mean, we abandoned Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalist Chinese after World War II. We abandoned the South Vietnamese people. We abandoned the Shah of Iran, and we abandoned the Cubans in the Bay of Pigs. And look at what happened in Afghanistan and Ukraine. We promised to protect them too, but we didn't. But the same cut and run crowd is now in power, and how can anyone in the world trust us anymore? The American influence in both the economic and political arenas have dropped dramatically over the last 20 years. They also look at how we've treated our other governments and that we've promised to protect. We promised to protect people, and when it comes time to make good on that promise, we abandon them. And the Europeans are afraid that we might do the same thing to them. They also see the wishy-washy way that we handled the war in Korea, then in Vietnam, and now in Iraq and Afghanistan. We throw our soldiers into a war, and then we tell them that they can't fight to win. The rules of engagement are so stupid that they tie their hands behind their back. Then we tell our soldiers to win that war, but don't you dare hurt anybody while you're doing it. Our politicians don't understand that the whole purpose of a strong military is to break things and kill people that threaten us. And trying to leave civilians out of the conflict is downright stupid. The civilians are the ones who support the military that you're fighting against. See, if we held that notion during World War II, we never would have won that war. Also, the Europeans have been watching how we've reacted to crisis situations recently, and they've decided that by the time our bureaucracy decides to do something, it would be too late. They also see all the cutbacks that we're making in Europe. The Democrats who currently hold the purse strings have always seen the military as a humanitarian organization that should spend its time passing out food and playing referee for the world. No wonder the European community is beginning to form its own defense system. France is already one of the largest arms producers in the world. Also, the way that Parliament is organized, it will be very easy for the Antichrist to take over. You see, the President of the European Union is appointed, he's not elected. Now, I'm not suggesting for a moment that this is the only way that God could fulfill these prophecies. In fact, God has a habit of doing it in ways we least expect him to. But the Bible does say that the believers will recognize the signs of his coming. So regardless of how he ultimately fulfills them, too many of these signs are visible today for us to simply ignore them. All right, next week we're going to take a closer look at this future dictator, the Antichrist.